What's going on, everybody? I'm Justin Thomas. Welcome to the channel. If you have not subscribed, make sure to do so, and if you want to support creativity, check out my Patreon link in the information below. This will be just kind of a quick video which will explore something I came across when doing research for a larger scale project, but nonetheless wanted to talk about really quick, and that is the ability for Game of Thrones to utilize and harness a cliffhanger in its pilot, when recently a cliffhanger has really kind of a negative connotation behind it, and it's not used as much these days because of long-form storytelling, and the stakes are a lot higher and the investment in the story is a lot higher. But more so, The Walking Dead pretty much sank its ship with a cliffhanger, and Game of Thrones sailed its ship and then kept a successful ship afloat, even with a tricky one to pull off. And I'm just going to lay those out for you because it's really not a good or bad situation. It's just one is a cliffhanger and one is literally just a incomplete script, and it's being passed off as a cliffhanger, and that's actually what makes these episodes in these series stand apart, and what makes one ship sail and another successful ship, The Walking Dead, ends up sinking. So the first clip is Negan's famous introduction slash season finale slash cliffhanger that sank the ship, and then we will look at two Game of Thrones cliffhangers, one that sailed the ship and another that kept it going even when they were killing off one of the fan favorites.
You can breathe, you can blink, you can cry. Hell, you're all gonna be doing that.
Setting high expectations for the character of Negan and doing nothing but talking up a character and then having a reveal and not concluding their story and simply calling it a cliffhanger. And we'll dive into exactly how this happens and exactly why it happens and the pros and the cons of long-form storytelling. Television has never had such quality storytelling, but also this can lead to issues, which are pretty much temptations for the showrunners, the writers, the network, whoever it may be, to continue on something that was once a great story but is now just a shell of itself in essentially professional fan fiction. But we'll discuss all that briefly, but we will discuss it.
The things I do for love.
An event in a story requires three elements: characters, function, and perhaps most importantly, a difference between expectation and result. So let's take a moment and really think about that last part. The expectation versus outcome. Well, what is the expectation of the viewer? It can vary, arguably, but a talented storyteller and a talented screenwriter will dictate the expectations of the viewers. Everybody knows George R.R. Martin. Even the most casual fan knows he likes to subvert fantasy tropes. You hear people say that all the time, and it's true. He subverts tropes. He also follows tropes because in order to subvert expectations, you must set expectations. If you essentially, in the end of Game of Thrones, if we see a happy wedding, that would be a fairy tale ending that would go along with a common fantasy trope, but would still be a subversion of the trope within this story, since George has set the expectation of any wedding to end in disaster. So let's talk about setting the expectation for an event, which consists of your character carrying out an action which completes your story. A quality, well done, and well received cliffhanger is accomplished by simply finishing your story. You don't show a character start to carry out an action. It's not acceptable to fade to black at that moment. It's not an opinion. There is a base structure and there are base rules to simple storytelling that you need to adhere to, and The Walking Dead doesn't adhere to them. They expect their audience to be content thinking about what the story is instead of giving them the story. By ending your episode, much less your season, without completing your story is unacceptable. That's why the fans, whether they realize it or not, are so upset. It's not because it's their favorite character or you're not sticking to the comics. It's simply because you failed to tell your story. In Game of Thrones, when we have a cliffhanger, even the toughest one, when you have everybody's favorite sweetheart, Kit Harington, taking a knife to the belly, you have disgruntled fans, but it doesn't sink the ship. it still works, and in reality, they couldn't have done it any differently. And I don't tend to give Dan and Dave a whole lot of slack, but in this case, there's really nothing to complain about. It's essentially exactly how the books end, and you have an entire story because you have a full event. You have a character carrying out action which leads to your event, and it causes conflict. We have long-form storytelling where we have multiple arcs and multiple storylines. The characters just don't have one go at it. These stories go on sometimes for 7 years, sometimes a decade. We see our characters grow and evolve, and we grow with them. So we know that when we come back to HBO's Game of Thrones world, that resurrection is a possibility, and we're wondering if that's going to happen. We know that there are outs for this because we witness a whole event. We didn't see somebody pull a knife and then cut the black. That's an incomplete story, and that would be an example of The Walking Dead did. If Jaime just pulls Bran back and then we don't see if he drops him, that's an incomplete story. But he does drop him, and what's interesting is, not to sound harsh, but we're not so much worried if Bran is alive or dead. We're actually more compelled by what does this mean for who they're setting up as your protagonist for your first few seasons, especially season 1. What does this mean for the Starks versus the Lannisters? What does this mean for Ned? Ned is your fantasy trope hero. This cliffhanger doesn't feel cheap because it isn't cheap. They properly conveyed their story, but they conveyed a compelling story. And with long-form storytelling, we all know that we have multiple arcs and we grow with our characters. As we know, Jaime is villainized throughout these actions. This is the characterization of Jaime Lannister, only to reveal true character later on. That is where you run into your narrative versus story when we start to have our POV chapters with Jaime Lannister, utilizing narration versus story and giving us a different narrative on our story so we can walk in our character's shoes and get true character reveals and character moments and connections that further immerse us into these great stories. It's arguably even worse when The Walking Dead also does have great canon material to work off of, but they still try to play off of deception for deception's sake. This has unfortunately been the fault of a few great shows as of late. Let your fans be immersed with your story. Don't dictate your story around your fan base. That's when long-form storytelling has its cons. When you have that much immersion, sometimes you can have weak-minded writers, or maybe just writers that didn't have a full outline for their story they're telling, and they are trying to just keep it in syndication for as long as humanly possible, and you can see characters develop plot armor, characters that have inconsistent motivations and desires, because they're no longer telling you their story, they're telling you about the characters that once existed in a well-told story, but is now reduced to what would be fair to call professional fan fiction. Pandering story poorly conveyed. A cliffhanger is not an incomplete story. It's not an excuse to leave your script half done. You're withholding a character's action within a set scene, which is part of a sequence, which is part of an act, which is part of your overall narrative and plot. So you're just not finishing your story, and you're not doing it for any other reason than you want to create false anticipation. And this is when fans feel like they've been deceived, and you can't blame them because there is no other excuse for it. Leave the expectations of what's happening because of this event within your story to be the cliffhanger, not the action. I'm Justin Thomas. Make sure to subscribe, and if you'd like to support creativity, make sure to check out the link for the Patreon in the information below. Thank you guys, and I'll see you soon.
I have no choice.
That's what you tell your family. Tell yourselves. That's what men always say when honor calls. You do have a choice, and you've made it.
You might not have my name. You have my blood.
You were never afraid.
There's nothing to be afraid of.
Chosen your opponents wisely.
I have a knack for it.
Perhaps I was wrong to distrust you.
Distrusting me was the wisest thing you've done since you climbed off your horse.
You think it's honor that's keeping the peace? It's fear. Fear and blood.